Welcome to By Faith, our current Elder Conversation podcast series where we walk through the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. I'm Laura, your host. Hebrews 11 gives us a list of examples, a cloud of witnesses that exemplify faithful obedience. Each week, one of our teaching pastors will take one of the people mentioned in the chapter and tell us what is their story, why is their faith exemplary, and what should we today learn and take away from their faith. Over the past few months, we have seen many stories of exemplary faith, of the patriarchs who we're told about throughout the book of Genesis. If you've missed any of our previous elder conversations, you can find them online at tcbchurch.org/elders. Today, we look at Moses. There is a lot that we could unpack in his story, but the author of Hebrews highlights a few reasons that he is commended for his faith. Hebrews 11:23 through 26 says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." So who is Moses? Why is his faith exemplary? And what should we learn from his faith?
As we continue through this great hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, few names have greater significance in the history of Israel than the man named Moses. You remember, Moses is so important in the history of Israel. God delivered his law through Moses. In fact, God's law is referred to as the law of Moses. Moses is known as the great deliverer of God's people Israel. When Jesus in the New Testament was on the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses is one of the characters who came and walked with Jesus in his transfigured form. Remember, Moses was born during a period of captivity for the nation of Israel. Moses was born during a particular cruel season when Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was so threatened by the Hebrew people that he had ordered every male Hebrew child to be born to be executed and thrown into the Nile River. In God's providence, Moses' parents defied that cruel order of the king, and you remember the story, placed Moses in a basket and floated him down the Nile River. Again, in God's providence, the king's daughter, Pharaoh's daughter, who just happened to be on the riverbank that day, came across the basket with baby Moses inside and was so moved with compassion, she took him in as her own child. So an incredible turn of events in God's providence. This Hebrew baby, who should have been killed under the decree of Pharaoh, actually became Egyptian royalty. Moses became the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. Moses grew up in Egypt for the next 40 years, but God had a greater call on his life. After fleeing from Egypt at around the age 40 and living as a shepherd for the next 40 years in the desert, God met Moses at the burning bush. It was there at that burning bush that God revealed himself to Moses as the great I am. It was there that God also revealed to Moses who Moses was to be. And God placed a particular call on Moses' life that he would return to Egypt and actually be the deliverer of God's people from Egyptian bondage. After a bit of arguing and trying to reason with God why God had the wrong guy and why Moses could not return to Egypt and why he was unable to do what God had called him to do, he turned in faith, went back to Egypt, and became the deliverer of God's people. By faith, he trusted God's promise that God, through Moses, would actually deliver the nation of Israel from Egyptian bondage. Now, why is Moses' life an example of faith for us? Examples of faith in the life of Moses are too many to recount here in this short podcast, but just from these few verses in Hebrews, we see a few things. Moses' life is characterized really by life decisions based not on what he could see with his human eyes, but what he could see through the eye of faith. Verse 24 tells us that Moses, by faith, refused something. He refused to continue to embrace this identity as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. In other words, for Moses to obey the call of God to be the deliverer of God's people, Moses had to reject his former identity as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He had to refuse the wealth, the fame, the power, the prestige, and all the comforts afforded him as Egyptian royalty in order to serve as the Hebrews' deliverer. In a sense, Moses had everything the world had to offer, but he walked away from that in faith to embrace the call of God on his life. We also see that Moses, by faith, chose suffering, ill treatment with God's people rather than to continue to live in what Hebrews calls here the passing pleasures of sin in verse 25. You could say it this way: Moses chose the eternal over what he could see in the moment. Faith does that. Faith often loses in the moment, but wins in the long run. Verse 26 says, he treasured, or he esteemed, the reproach of Christ, the promise of a Messiah, to be greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for Moses was looking for the reward. Moses chose, by faith, the greater treasures that he could not yet see, instead of all the temporary, infinite wealth that he could see. He walked by faith. He walked away from something significant in order to embrace something of eternal significance. Also in Moses' life, we see something hugely important, and it's this: that faith is only as good as its object. In one of what I think to be the most significant verses in all of this chapter is verse 27. By faith, Moses forsook Egypt. He did not fear the wrath of the king, and humanly speaking, he had a reason to fear. But the reason he did not fear the king is because he had a greater fear. He endured, verse 27, as seeing him who is unseen. What a description of faith. God, the Messiah, the promised Messiah, was the object of his faith. He lived as seeing him who is unseen. What can we learn from the life of Moses? A few things. 1, our ultimate identity is found in knowing the God of the Bible and being numbered with his people. By faith, Moses refused and walked away from a significant earthly identity to embrace an identity that was greater, knowing God and being numbered with his people. Number 2, we recognize by faith that sin can be pleasurable, but only for the moment, and that faithful obedience always yields eternal rewards. Rarely does faith only live for the moment. Number 3, God's people live through the eye of faith. What that practically means is that the reality of God, his promises, his Son, our future reward are more real to us than what we can see now with our human eye. By faith, Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Moses walked by faith.